Thank you for joining us today. I am Allison Van, the Executive Director of CRESS, and I'm delighted to welcome Alan Martino to speak with us today as part of the CRESS Virtual Collab Productivity During Pandemic Speaker Series. I'd like to begin by giving honor and thanks to the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations as the traditional inhabitants of the lands where McMaster stands. To say that is to acknowledge a debt to those who were here before us and to recognize our responsibility as guests to respect and honor the intimate relationship Indigenous peoples have to this land. Alan is a PhD candidate in sociology here at Mac, and we'll be speaking today about some of what he has learned in his dissertation research about opportunities and challenges for adults with intellectual disabilities to have satisfying romantic and sexual lives here in Ontario. So thank you so much for joining us, Alan. Take it away.
Perfect. So first of all, thank you so much again for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity. It's always a pleasure to talk about this topic that I'm very passionate about. I've actually been exploring it since my undergraduate years, and it has just grown and grown even more in my life. So I really appreciate this opportunity. In this presentation, I will discuss one of the sections of my dissertation work, which is about the question of sexual access and barriers in the lives of people with intellectual disabilities. More specifically, I want to be thinking about particular disabling social processes like infantilization, lack of information, and boundary work that really constrain the experiences and sexualities of people with intellectual disabilities. To do that, I'm drawing on my qualitative study with 46 adults with intellectual disabilities in different parts of the province. I will talk for 40 minutes, and then we can have some time for comments and questions, and I look forward to talking to you about this. So broadly speaking, my interest is really in this area of disability and sexuality with a particular focus on intimate citizenship. This is a concept that refers to, as Plummer defines, and quote, our rights to choose what we do with our bodies, our feelings, our identities, our relationships, our eroticisms, and our representations, end quote. My interest in disability and sexuality comes from two places. Firstly, it comes from my experience growing up with an older sibling with a disability who made me aware of some of the challenges in terms of forming intimate relationships. At the same time, I also saw my own parents struggle to support a loved one in terms of approaching this topic that is often considered to be an uncomfortable topic for a lot of family members. So for me, it was about how can we support families and people with disabilities better navigate these experiences. Secondly, in my community partnership, I worked with an arts program for people with intellectual disabilities back in New York State when I was doing my undergraduate years. One particular instance really stuck with me. One day, doing this improvisation exercise, a young man with Down syndrome said, "Love is natural. We all love." There was no significant response from the audience at that point. However, as he continued the scene, then saying, "SEX, that's what I want," then the whole dynamics in the room really changed. People in the room, meaning the support workers and other people with disabilities, reacted to those statements with some embarrassment, a nervous laughter, and immediately one of the workers ended the scene that the young man was doing and attempted to change the topic by saying, quote, "Isn't the weather beautiful today?" End quote. So sadly, nobody commented or even acknowledged those statements. And consequently, sexuality remained a taboo topic. It was like an elephant in the room that people just choose to ignore. So that experience really made me interested in exploring disability, sexuality. And this is because I would hope that such instances like this young man would serve as opportunities to encourage discussions about sexuality rather than shut down conversations and reinforce norms that deem sexuality and disability as incompatible. Not only that, it's important to keep in mind that the sexual rights of people with disabilities are enshrined in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. So it's important that we protect those rights. So this still is a taboo topic. In our social world, people with intellectual disabilities face two dominant controlling images. On one hand, they're commonly seen as being incapable of having sexual desires, and they're seen as being, in quotes, eternal children. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen people saying, "Oh, Johnny's so cute and adorable," even though this man was already in his 30s and 40s. On the other hand, people with intellectual disabilities are also understood to have deviant or excessive sexualities that often leads to calls for restrictions on their sexual rights. Of course, it is important to recognize the protection of people with intellectual disabilities. It's a serious matter, especially considering the long history of, of people with intellectual disabilities experiencing abuse, discrimination, and exploitation in many aspects of their lives. We know, for example, that people with intellectual disabilities are at a higher risk of experiencing forms of abuse in their lives in comparison with non-disabled people. However, it's also important to think about, in this increased setting of risk, is there a way to move forward in a way that does not deny people their access or their rights to form intimate relationships? And I think that's one of the things that I try to do in my work. How can we move forward in a way that is safe, but also respects the rights of people to make their own choices and sometimes take risks and make mistakes? So while this area of research is certainly growing, and I have colleagues even at McMaster University, Dr. Enfred Shermans, who's been doing incredible work in this area, this still remains an under-researched and under-theorized research area. So we need to understand much better how do the sexual and intimate lives of people with intellectual disabilities actually look like? So for me, I've been very interested in this notion of sexual access. Scholars like Shuttleworth have critiqued the sexualities literature for not considering the importance of sexual access in terms of shaping the lives of marginalized groups. So while there has been some attention in disability studies in terms of thinking about sexuality, people with intellectual disabilities have received less attention. And that's why I've been very interested in capturing these particular experiences and thinking about this notion of sexual access. So let's get to the juicy part here, right? In our pursuit for intimate partners, for sex, for pleasure, for romance, sexual actors navigate a wide range of sexual fields or sexual spaces that bring together people looking for those things. This includes, for example, bars, nightclubs, coffee shops, university campuses, dating websites, phone apps. I'm sure if I were to ask people, most of you have used one of this or participated in at least one of the sexual fields. There are innumerable sexual fields to choose from these days. Yet, what sexuality scholars sometimes take for granted is that access to the sexual fields is a very critical issue. The fact that not every sexual actor can actually enter and participate in the spaces due to constraints. So this is precisely one of the contributions that my research makes. So I raised two questions. What about sexual actors who are not even allowed to access sexual fields in the first place? What about sexual actors who are not unaware even of sexual fields available to them? These are insights that, I'll show you some of the findings in my study, we'll be able to have a much better understanding. So I'm proposing that before discussing the experience of sexual actors who are able to enter and participate in the sexual spaces, it is important to take a step back and examine the question of who can access sexual fields and who is being left out. And that's what disability brings to the table. So for the presentation today, I will focus on one of the questions that I examined in my dissertation, which is, what are some of the systematic barriers that adults with intellectual disabilities face to participating in sexual fields? That said, we can certainly discuss some other questions that I've addressed in my dissertation in our Q&A time. So it was very important for me in this research to center the voice of people with intellectual disabilities, acknowledging them as agents, as mini makers of their own lives. As you see, if you do a quick literature review in this area, most of the literature has actually focused on the experiences and perspectives of other social actors in their lives, including families and support workers, with a lot less space for people with intellectual disabilities themselves to share their experiences. It's interesting, even in the process of receiving ethics approval from other institutions, I've seen how I've been questioned in terms of, do you really need to speak with people with intellectual disabilities? Or another quote that I got, are they gonna give you any good data, end quote. This is another conversation we can have at the end. So for me, it was very important to make sure that those voices were present and represented and centered in this work. So after receiving ethics approval from the ethics board, actually 3 different boards, I recruited participants using a complex and multi-layered recruitment strategy. Included posters in public spaces and social media, recruitment through service agencies, self-advocacy groups, snowball sampling. The data presented here derived from 46 in-depth interviews with 33 men and 13 women with intellectual disabilities across 4 different cities in Ontario. Participants range from 23 to 64, and each participant was given a $20 gift card of their choice, out of a few choices. This was important because people with intellectual disabilities in Canada are more likely to be living under the poverty line than non-disabled people. So that was very important to recognize their time. So let's get to the main themes of my findings. So in what follows, I want to highlight some of the systematic barriers that some of my participants face to participate in sexual fields. My first theme focuses on how some participants have been infantilized by social actors in their lives, and consequently have experienced significant restrictions on their ability to participate in sexual spaces, regardless of their age and adult status. One thing that I wanted to highlight, the experience that I'm talking about here, these are all adults who are their own guardians even, okay? So keep that in mind as you read this quotes and experiences. Now, while it's normative for non-disabled people, especially adults, to have privacy and have romantic relationships and be sexual, when it comes to people with intellectual disabilities, it is as though the same expectations do not apply. For people with intellectual disabilities, reaching chronological age of adulthood may not necessarily lead to more opportunities for relationships, privacy, or intimacy. Indeed, some of my participants spoke about instances of infantilization that really discouraged them from participating in sexual fields. So this infantilization was particularly evident in Matthew's experience. Matthew was a 39-year-old man who never had a romantic relationship in his life. He lives at home with his mother, and in his interview, he repeatedly noted that he was not ready yet for any kind of romantic relationship. When I asked him about what made him feel that way, he stated, "My mom told I'm not ready," end quote. Then, when asked to elaborate, he observed, "I have too much homework, too much." It's very interesting that, one could say that being told that one has too much homework and that they should prioritize that is often something that we tell to children and adolescents. Moreover, shifting the focus to homework allows for sexual expression to be postponed in a way. And then we end up placing Matthew in a position of what some have called suspended adolescence. And this is a 39-year-old man. Matthew shared that he expects to eventually be ready for a romantic relationship, perhaps, as he said, quote, "when I get a bit older, like 50, end quote." It's very interesting. The first time that I had, this interview, it didn't really strike me as particularly key, the number itself. But as I started continue doing more and more interviews, I started noticing a pattern where a few interviewees were saying something very similar. They were told that they should wait until their 40s and 50s to even have a romantic relationship. So it's reasonable to say that waiting until one is 50 years of age, even to have a romantic relationship, really goes against normative experiences of sexuality among most non-disabled adults. Most people do tend to form relationships and be sexually active at a much earlier age. And it's interesting, in addition to not having romantic relationships, Matthew has also refrained from watching pornographic films, an avenue that could provide him with some opportunity for at least some pleasure or masturbation as he waits until he feels ready to be in a romantic relationship. However, in his case, that is not even an option. As Matthew shared, he says, "Mom told I need to be older to watch that," end quote. So his experience points to a boundary work where other social actors establish what one is ready for relationships what kinds of sexual practices are allowed. So this is someone else setting the boundaries of what sexuality can look like for the folks that I interviewed. And this boundary work is evident in other interviews as well. As another example, Thomas, 36 years old, also articulated his expectation that he should wait until a later age to consider getting married. In his case, until his late 40s, even though he'd never had a relationship before. Thomas, however, seemed unsure about the age that he was legally allowed to get married. Thomas actually posed the following question during his interview. He said, "So, you have to be 36 to get married." When I informed him that individuals in Ontario are legally allowed to marry at a much earlier age, Thomas was very surprised, and I wish I could describe his facial expression at the time. As he remarked, "Okay, so if you're 18, you can get married." "Okay, because no one ever told me that." Some studies have indeed found that people with intellectual disabilities can sometimes be purposely misinformed in order to delay, discourage, and prevent sexual expression. In Thomas' case, we see his lack of information, though we don't know whether it was done intentionally or not, about his right to marry. And I can provide you lots of other examples in terms of misinformation, especially around birth control and women with intellectual disabilities. Now, I want to turn our attention to participants' access to sexuality education. I want to demonstrate how participants, with some level of education, there has been a very disproportionate focus on negative aspects of sexuality. Really shapes how they understand their own sexuality and how they might choose not to participate in sexual fields due to fear. And, fear was a keyword, as you see. So in my research, I found that almost half of my participants had not received any kind of sexuality education. At times, they were simply automatically removed from sexuality education on the assumption that their disability labeled, meant that they did not need such information. For participants with some level of information was solely focused on negative aspects of sexualities. It was about risks, abuse, sexually transmitted diseases, unplanned pregnancies. And this is a very extremely narrow view of sexuality, as we know. Sexuality is not just about that. Sexuality is also about love, intimacy, holding hands, eye contact, pleasure, as we all know. So, as an example, David, who has been in a non-sexual romantic relationship with a woman with intellectual disability, talked about the sexual education he had received. He says, "Well, we talked about the different parts of the male and the female, about what STDs, what STIs, what transmitted diseases is. I think I talked about everything, what sexuality is all about. It's really significant here that this limited understanding of sexuality, only focused on biology, sexually transmitted diseases, became internalized by David as what sexuality is all about. For most young people, sexuality involves much more than STIs, risk, and harm. It's about love, exploration, sex, pleasure. Those positive aspects of sexuality, however, did not receive equal attention in the sexuality education offered to my participants. And as a consequence, their sense of self as a sexual being was shaped in particular ways that limited their possibilities and devalued them as sexual actors. Also, it serves to reproduce a culture of fear around sexuality because it's solely understood in negative terms. Look at this example. This focus only on negative aspects of sexuality sometimes it scared my participants to the point of making them refrain from forms of sexual expression. Look at Randy, for example. He says, sometimes they make it scary. This is inappropriate, or this is wrong, or this is illegal, or this is dangerous. This isn't fun anymore. I don't want to do it, have sex. It's not going to be any good. Now think about it. Anyone would be terrified of being sexual if they're told these messages, right? Where sexuality, sexual expression gets tangled with danger and illegality all the time. Yet, this limited message is what most people are receiving. These negative messages have had actual consequences on the lives of my participants. In Randy's case, for example, he refrained from having sex. He says, I never really had sex with anybody for a long time because I didn't think it was appropriate. And I never knew how to ask, and I didn't want to upset them. And he was not the only participant who decided to remain single and celibate in order to avoid getting in trouble. And this notion of getting in trouble was a significant one. The level of surveillance, the level of control meant that people had to find ways to stay out of trouble, even if it meant not having relationships. Or look another example of the consequence of this negative messages on sexuality. Christopher also often refers to sexuality and dating as something scary. When elaborating on what makes relationships scary, he immediately asserted, someone wants to rape you like that. So in Randy's and Christopher cases, there is an important tension to note. The tension between being a danger and in danger. Where Christopher talks about feeling scared and vulnerable, thus being in danger, Randy talks about the feeling or the fear of landing into trouble, doing something illegal. So his sexuality represents a danger in this case. So I'm thinking back to those controlling images, whether you're seen as vulnerable and naive, or you're seen as a potential dangerous to others because you have supposedly an excessive sexuality. We see that at play here. Finally, it's very interesting that people got very infantilized information. So James, for example, he talks about the birds and the bees, right? This is, again, information that we often talked with children, and not even in the current times, I would hope. Things that we talked in the past. Or in James' case, for example, he talks about how he learned that doing romantic relationships the right way, in quotes, as he says, meant not sexually touching his girlfriend, with whom he has been dating for years. He says, no touch. I never touch her. My girl would never too. I ask her to stop. I put my hand up like this. I say, excuse me. I say, stop right there. He was actually not the only one who had been taught that dating the right way or the positive way requires not touching your partner and not being sexually active, even in long-term relationships. And this is a very critical insight because we might believe that policies that discourage people from being romantic and sexual are done. But as we can see, there are still more subtle ways that we're finding to prevent people from expressing their sexuality. So these accounts also show how even in relationships, people can manage to find partners. Their relationships can be desexualized in ways that look more almost like friendships instead. So another example here, Allison, the way she learned about doing relationships is that it's always distance from each other. I'm okay if it's beside me, but not that close. Again, we see a kind of relationship that looks kind of different from most normative, relationships among non-disabled people. Most importantly, there is a gender component to the information that people are learning. One of the things that I learned is that men and women are sometimes getting different information. Sometimes they're participating in men's and women's group, which already assumes heterosexuality, cisgenderism, it assumes a whole bunch of things, right? By separating men and women in these groups. But it's interesting that they are learning different lessons. So Cheryl, for example, who was a part of a woman's group, learned that being a good woman meant not being sexual, right? And it's interesting, this quote, the way it comes about was, I was explaining to Cheryl that I would not use her name, her real name in sharing the results, and that I would create a fake name for her. So I usually give fun examples like pop music that I'm a big fan of, like Madonna or Mariah Carey. But it was interesting that Cheryl immediately jumped in and said, not Madonna, she is a slut, right? And I mean, it's not surprising because Madonna is portrayed as a sexual woman, is about sexual expression and all of that, right? So, which is totally the opposite of what Cheryl has been taught of what it means to be a good woman or be a good woman in the right way. Okay, let me go to the last insight here, lacking a feel for the game. So here I want to talk about the lack of adequate tools and information about sexuality that have led some of my participants to feel as though they lack a feel for the game. This means basically knowing what are the sexual spaces that are available to them, and most promising, and what are the most promising spaces for finding intimate partners, how to navigate those spaces. So participants talk to me about feeling as though they lack the tools to feel confident enough to even enter and participate in the game, right? So they were sitting in the outskirts of the field in essence. So participants were infantilizing ways that they don't even know how to start relationships or where to find partners. And in the larger, literature on sexual fields and sexualities, which often has not paid attention to disability, it's assumed that sexual actors have knowledge of the sexual fields that are available to them, and regardless of their decision whether to participate or not, but they know where to go. But what is interesting in my research is that I found that some people don't even know where to start. So Andrew was one of the many participants who spoke about not knowing where to begin. He says, I don't even know how to start looking. I've looked for a girlfriend almost all over. Nobody. People don't help me. I would have loved if someone could help me find a girlfriend. What is interesting here too is the fact that we're very good at helping people with intellectual disabilities with other parts of their lives, especially issues related to the public sphere, like jobs, education. But when it comes to more private sphere issues like relationships and intimacy, we're not doing enough, right? It's often seen as less important or a topic that is just too uncomfortable to talk about. So there's research on this that shows that there's a continued prioritization in service provision of needs and issues pertaining to the public lives over those in the private sphere. And according to my research data, this trend continues as some of the participants felt like they were left in the position where they could only wait and see what happens when it comes to relationships. And it's fascinating. So Andrew, for example, who said he doesn't even know how to start looking, he actually approached support workers asking for advice and help, but without much success. So Andrew, for example, was simply told, just go out more. Think about it. If you grow up being desexualized, infantilized, with no opportunities to build those kinds of relationships, being told just go out more doesn't really help you. So not surprisingly, participants, talked about lacking the tools necessary to know how to play the game, or even where the game is even taking place. Sadly, participants often talked about having a hard time finding partners, and due to a small network and really feeling isolated. So Tony shared his frustration. He says, I hate being alone. I just come home. I've tried so hard. I looked and I looked till I almost turned purple. That's how hard I looked. So whereas for most non-disabled people, these questions may seem somewhat trivial and straightforward, like where do you go to meet a partner? People with intellectual disabilities face unique challenges in terms of navigating these questions. And the problem is they've tried to navigate these questions with very little to no support. And that's the problem. Participants also pointed out that willingness to participate, to sexual fields requires some level of confidence. For example, Iago, who had never had a girlfriend before, despite having an interest in having one, said, you gotta be, confident to meet new people. And that's a very key insight. Even the very fact of deciding whether to participate into or enter a sexual field like a dating app, it takes confidence and it takes courage to even say, I'm going to participate in the space. Dating, as Brandy says, is really, really, really hard sometimes. And some people, like the people that I interview sometimes, they see themselves as having very little chance in the first place. And they see themselves as unable to attract a good long-term partner. So they just decide that they shouldn't even navigate those spaces. And this is what Brandy says here. I mean, I will be frustrated, but at least I won't get in trouble. So this is in reference to his decision to remain celibate. The fear of landing into trouble was shared by so many of my participants, especially men. And this fear speaks to, constructions of disabled sexualities, especially masculine disabled sexualities, as excessive, as dangerous. And people, these men that I talked to, they were aware of those constructions and the potential consequences. So as a response, the men spoke extensively about attempting to learn about how to be a man in the right way or in a positive way, which, as we learned already, sometimes meant never touching your girlfriend, never being intimate with your girlfriend, a very different kind of relationship. Also, it's important to note that a lot of people experience significant kinds of punishment and restrictions. Some people were not allowed to have locks in their doors. Some people were not allowed to access pornography, even in the privacy of their rooms. Some people are not allowed to have people come over to their place or to their room. Some people are not allowed the privacy to have a girlfriend or a boyfriend, or even couples that I spoke to, even though they had been dating for quite a few years. They were not allowed to call each other at certain times or days of the week, or they could only meet each other twice a week while the parents were watching nearby. As you can imagine, it must be very hard to hook up with someone and make out when your parents are right behind you, right? So lots of restrictions that really prevent people from having normative kinds of relationships. Now, as a final example, I want to show you one that illustrates how people are not just taking those constraints and limitations, right? They're fighting back, and they're finding creative ways to resist those restrictions. So to show how some participants exercised agency, Chelsea was one of the participants that talked about keeping her intimate relationship with a man with intellectual disabilities a secret from her support worker. In Chelsea's case, at first, she had asked her support worker to sit with us during the interview. Yet, the moment her support worker left the room for a few minutes just to answer a phone call, Chelsea quickly whispered to me, and I wish I could translate that to you. So think about it as whispering voice and very quick. We're not having sex, but just because we're in love. But don't tell Linda that. Nobody knows about me and him. It's a secret. Don't tell Linda. Promise me you won't tell Linda? Sheldon never cheats on me. Sheldon doesn't cheat on me. He's my boyfriend and I don't want anybody to know. You won't tell nobody? End quote. At this point, her support worker had returned to the room and the interview continued. Although I was unable to do a follow-up interview with Chelsea because she was experiencing sickness, it's significant how she felt the need to keep her romantic relationship a secret. This, nonetheless, also demonstrates Chelsea's attempt at asserting her agency, trying to maintain a romantic relationship despite all the surveillance and barriers and constraints, even if it needs to remain a secret. So, to summarize this presentation, my hope is to highlight the importance of considering the question of sexual access when thinking about sexual fields, to better understand the experiences of sexual actors who, willingly or not willingly, do not participate in the spaces in the first place. My interview suggests that people with intellectual disabilities are actually kept out of sexual fields through a series of disabling social processes. This included their infantilization, a lack of information regarding sexuality, as well as tremendous focus on negative aspects, emotions, and information related to sexuality. A sexuality shaped by these various processes have led some people with intellectual disabilities to perceive themselves as not worth it, and to understand sexuality as limited to risk, danger, and negative aspects. This view of sexuality becomes to some what sexuality is all about. As illustrated in this presentation, the consequences on participants' sense of selves, which is then mainly couched on discussions around risk and harm, are damaging. Poignant among my participants is how disabled sexualities are then seldomly open to the possibility of pleasure. Pleasure is a topic that barely makes it to the table. So, my intention is to contribute to theory, empirical research, and advocacy. I will continue taking a leadership role in facilitating dialogues about disability and sexuality, working towards social justice, further complicating what we think we know, and proposing new approaches to understand this complex topic. Listening to participants' stories has been an incredible gift to me. I've learned so much through the stories, and I've also had so many funny moments working in the field. For some participants, this was their very first time ever talking openly, free of judgment about their intimate lives and dreams. And I'm a firm believer that the sexual stories can generate possibilities for sexual justice and intimate citizenship. I'd like to thank this project that has been funded by the Ontario Trillium Scholarship, the Society for the Scientific Study of Sexuality, and the Ontario Association of Developmental Disabilities, as well as my committee members for asking me very challenging and amazing questions, but most importantly to my participants who were so open and kind and generous to share a very intimate part of their lives with a stranger, with me. So thank you so much for your time today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Alan. That was fascinating. So as a reminder, if you have a question, feel free, if you would like to ask it, to just indicate in chat that you have a question, or if you would like me to read it, I am happy to read them, in which case type the full question. And I will, I have a lot, but I will try to restrain myself. So I'll start with one of mine. One of the things that really struck me in listening to you was the extent to which you're layering something that in general people are incredibly bad at giving meaningful information about, at being honest with people in their lives about all of the problems that we have as a broadly as society in terms of sexuality, and then you are layering on top of that the infantilization, the misrepresentation, the lack of learning, the lack of access. And so I was curious about that that aspect of this, of applying something that we are already bad at to a situation that adds additional complications or challenges.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. It definitely adds a whole different layer, right? And I think one of the biggest tensions that, are talked about, I've worked with so many family members and service providers in the community. And one of the key things when it comes to information is that some people have told me that they fear that giving information to people with intellectual disabilities will encourage them to get in trouble or to do things that will land them into trouble. But what I've been trying to do is really show that the opposite happens, right? Is by giving people good information that they're better able to protect themselves and have a safer and more satisfying romantic intimate life. So I'm trying to show how it's not, there are many ways that we make people more vulnerable. For example, by not giving good, accessible information. So the best way forward is to have more open discussions around this. Of course, if we talk about here people who are watching live, how many of us had parents who were comfortable talking to us about sexuality openly, right? And providing very clear supports on this and hands-on experience. Not a lot of us. So we already live in a culture in which sexuality is a taboo topic, but it makes it more challenging when you add disability to this.
So I was also really curious about gender identity and sexual identity beyond beyond just sort of understanding it in terms of partnered relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And it strikes me that part of the evolution of what's happened broadly around sexuality is an understanding that gender identity and sexuality exist in a lot of much wider range of experiences and kinds of activity and engagement than was traditionally talked about or understood. And I imagine for some portion of the population that experiences intellectual disabilities and also understandings of their own sexuality, or maybe even just hints of understandings, this adds a much deeper sort of level of complication.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's another amazing question, right? It's very interesting. My second chapter is actually called Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, because I cannot tell you how many times I heard that quote being used by participants. And it's, and I think one of the reasons behind that is that a lot of the, my participants, they are constantly navigating spaces that are gender segregated. So for example, they're living group homes that are based on gender, or they live in the same house, but their floors are segregated and men are not allowed to be in women's floor and vice versa, right? So they're constantly bombarded by this segregation, this binary world, even as I told you, right, about the men and women's groups. It's interesting even, like there's literature that shows that some of these women groups, for example, are teaching women how to knit, like to do particular gendered ideas, and most of the time, these are very traditional ways of thinking about gender. I can, for example, only one of the women that I spoke with talked about feminism, even in a positive way. I spoke with other women who either were very passionate about not identifying themselves as feminists, or who were not even aware of what that meant, right? So for most of my participants, it was really about hanging on to gender traditional roles. Women, some of the ones that I talked to, for example, they have this image that dating, they should not take active, role in it. They should wait for men to approach them. The man will propose. It's almost like a Disney scene in a way, right? So it's really the sexuality that is allowed here is almost like a PG-13 sexuality. Like the Snow White and the Prince, they might kiss once, like one peck on the cheek or one peck, but that's as far as they go, right? And it's like romantic heterosexual love. And the last thing I'll say to your comment, is the heterosexual nature of this, right? The ways that it's assumed that everyone is heterosexual, right? Through this. Very few of my participants, I can count on one hand the number of people who even thought about the possibility of going beyond heterosexuality. It was simply out of their menu of options. Or even if they thought about it, they either didn't feel comfortable navigating queer spaces, or they just didn't feel like they had the support to be able to explore that part of their lives. So for the most part, the love that was reproduced is like romantic love, PG-13, heterosexual.
Cheryl, you have some questions?
Unmute myself. Thanks, Alan. That was really interesting. My question really was around the guardianship of some of these interview candidates. Were any of the parental guardians present, or did they give their input at some point? Just to explain why they were holding their, like, I don't want to say child, another child, why they were holding their, I guess, then back and explaining that they weren't ready at the age of 50 or 60, that they weren't ready, and what was their logic behind doing that at that age still.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let me just write here. Okay, so it's a lot of reasons. I've certainly worked with family members. I think the key reasons is one, discomfort with sexuality. I cannot tell you how many parents have said, I haven't even figured out my own sexuality, and or talked about desire in myself even. How can I speak to my son and daughter about this stuff? Yeah. So there is or they just feel like they don't have enough information, or the resources to do these conversations, the discomfort. And think about it, right? Sometimes even people with intellectual disabilities don't want to talk to their parents about this, right? Like I did not want to have these conversations about masturbation with my parents. So, which is totally understandable, right? So it's about how can we build more spaces, one, for families to be able to understand the rights of their sons and daughters, to be able to be more supportive, have the information they need, to be able to create a space that nourishes questions and opportunities. But also, how can we create separate spaces where people with disabilities can ask those questions in a comfortable way, right? And it's very fascinating, because when I was doing recruitment, I actually got a phone call from a mother who was very well-intentioned. She was like, my son needs to participate in the study. I know he wants a girlfriend, but he doesn't know how to do it. I have no clue how to talk to him about it. Can you please talk to him about it? And I really appreciate it. Like on one hand, I really appreciated this mom really taking that step, right? Like it shows how much she really cares about it. Of course, I respected the son's desire to whether or not to participate in the study, right? That's the one that counts for me, like the most important one. And he ended up not participating. He does not feel comfortable talking about it yet. But it's interesting nonetheless that the mom took that step. So I see some parents being open about it and trying their best, just not having the resources or spaces to do that.
Right. And then my second question, if I can, are there safe spaces with trained resources where they can have these conversations, where they can go, have people been trained enough on these conversations? Because I cannot see these conversations being easy, for one, because you're dealing with the mental capacity that with a full range that could understand that this is a problem and I want to date, to I don't even want to have that conversation. So are we yet at the point where we have centers or trained professionals that can, in a safe space, discuss this with these people?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's incredible. So there are some safe spaces and like self-advocacy groups who are building those spaces, led and by people with disabilities themselves. They are hoping to create those conversations more openly, and even bringing people, right? Researchers and community members should talk about their experiences and research work. I've had that opportunity before to talk to self-advocates and share some of the knowledge that I have from academia and learn about their experiences on, really living in the community. So there are places like this. There are a handful of organizations that are really working hard. They're trying to build better policies that really protect the rights of people. They're trying to build better training for their support workers. The flip side of it is what I've seen and the literature shows is that most of the time most organizations do not provide training to their staff workers, support workers. They do not provide guidelines. So most of the time, support direct care workers are kind of choosing how they deal with these situations.
Right.
So if you think about it, for one person might encounter a support worker who's very supportive of the sexual expression. And then the next day, they might encounter someone who's really not okay with that. And that makes it very confusing and very difficult for people. And it sometimes land in trouble because of that. The other piece around it that I've written before is around the power struggles. So parents or family members sometimes don't feel comfortable. They push organizations to do that talk, right?
Yeah.
And then the organizations are afraid because this is a very sensitive topic, right? It can land them into trouble in terms of legal issues and get in trouble with families. So they push back to the families this responsibility. And then who addresses this is the question. When I first started doing this research was back in New York State as an undergraduate student, and I had an opportunity to interview 26 organizations around the state, as well as a government agency that supposedly organizes these organizations. What the government person said, and I never forget his quote, was, when they talk about sexuality and disability, we kind of get the joke. Just say no, end quote. And that, unfortunately, has been one of the approach from some organizations, right? Even when I talked on the phone for recruitment with some organizations, I had people hang up on me as soon as I used the word sexuality. Yeah. Or people who said, we don't have anything to say about that. Or there are more important things to talk about. So we're still in moments of transition, I guess.
And it's interesting because it's a topic, I'm studying social work right now, and I brought it up with my psychology professor. And I said to her, Friday, there's this gentleman, and I gave the basis of your topic. And she immediately became uncomfortable. And it was an interesting conversation because we were on Zoom and I could see there was an immediate discomfort. And I think it was a combination of not knowing enough about the topic and not knowing where to go with the topic itself. So there's clearly a gap in what we're teaching students coming through as well that needs to be taught within that area.
Absolutely. And I've had the opportunity to give guest lectures to occupational therapists, physical therapists, and it's interesting, right? Because they're asking people oftentimes, what are your needs in your life, right? And they're really good at identifying needs around like social life and, you know, other parts of life. But when it comes to that damn question around sexual life, they feel so uncomfortable. So for me, it was about like, okay, let's practice this. How would you ask, the same way that you ask about people's educational needs, how would you ask about their sexual or romantic needs? Because it shouldn't be any different, right? The same way that we asked about those other experiences, we should be able to ask those questions.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I'm done hogging your time.
I have a question, if that's okay. Hi, nice to meet you. I'm Tamara.
Hello, nice to
I'm
meet you.
a dual diagnosis case manager at the Canadian Mental Health Association in Halton. This was an incredible presentation. Thank you so much. Having worked at different agencies in Toronto and Halton with individuals with developmental disabilities as well as mental health diagnoses, a big issue at the agencies that I worked at, specifically earlier on when I was working in residential settings, was that they could not be 100% assured that the individuals there would act with fully informed consent. Just because of the level of functioning and understanding. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts around that and around how to navigate that piece so that people living in these group homes and in these types of situations can express their sexuality in a healthy and informed way.
Yes. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. You understand the complexities of, you know, I'm sure of this, all these relationships that are involved in making those decisions, you know, and this question around consent and capacity is such a big issue, right? And it's an individual thing, like, you know, it's case by case. But I think one of the things that I noticed is that, you know, there have been an explosion of different resources in terms of ways of better explaining information to people and getting a sense of how much they understand, you know, like in terms of information that we can provide. So for me, it has really been about how can we change the way we can provide information to people in a way that makes it accessible and makes sense to the person. Not every, you know, and as you know, some people are just not interested in relationships, or they might not be interested in having particular aspects of sexuality, right? So it's about understanding what are people's needs and trying to think about what kinds of supports in place can we put for this person to have a, you know, a good life and respect their rights. It's a very tough question, right? Of course, we want to protect people. That's a very important question. But for me, what I found in the literature and from experience is that it's about working with the individual as much as we can and trying to share knowledge, information, you know, and keeping that conversation open at least, right?
Yeah, so not that much different than somebody without an intellectual disability would do, right? Yeah, thank you.
Exactly, right? And figuring out being creative in terms of how we deliver information, right? Like it doesn't need to be, you know, I remember, for example, one of my participants, he was extremely confused about the banana. Like he went to a workshop and he did not understand like what the banana meant, right? Because for some folks, okay, it might be very straightforward. The banana means this. But for him, he didn't make that connection. So that wasn't an effective way of delivering information, right? So how can we provide a better way for this young man, you know?
Thank you.
I have another question around I'm trying to think how to frame it. Representation of others with intellectual disabilities in relationships and the extent to which, you know, there are sort of spaces online that might mimic or be sort of subforms within dating sites, the extent to which there is anyone sort of making an effort in pornography to do representative porn and sort of respectful porn. If there are any movements on those fronts to be able to create sexual fields that address a lot of these complexities.
Yeah, no, that's a great question too. So it's interesting. When I asked participants what kinds of spaces they were able to navigate, digital sexual fields like dating apps, dating websites was one of them. even though most of them did not have positive experiences, they talked about how they negotiate those spaces, whether they disclose their disability, right? It's one interesting example that I can give from a previous study I've done is that I had interview this couple, they both had intellectual disabilities, and that meant that their spelling had some issues. So people would easily notice that they had some issues with spelling and writing, which is a very key way of communicating sometimes online, right? Their strategy for it, because they understood very quickly that disclosing their disability, especially intellectual disability, often discourage other partners, was to go to the neighbor's house and the neighbor would do a grammar spelling check for them before they would send the messages. Like how creative and amazing way, right, they found in terms of navigating the space that they perhaps would be disadvantaged in a way. Another interesting space that I found people going to was the church. The church is one of the places that, you know, people have access to, like they have supports in their lives that take them to these places on the weekends. And some people actually see that as a potential sexual space where they can meet someone, to the point that they go to them and they are looking at people's rings. Do they have a ring or not? You know, so that's another key space that people have been using. One final example that I'll give is phone sex. I had the 3 participants who were able to access phone sex for a very short amount of time. The problem was none of them have access to that anymore. And the reason was not their own choice, but other people's in their lives. So one of the young men that I spoke with, for example, as soon as his parents saw that on his phone bill, he took away the phone of this young man and said that this is not okay, this is not appropriate. So he no longer has access to the technology needed to do this. His way around it, which is, I mean, it's amazing how people find ways around it, right? I think that really shows the agency of people. He borrows the phone from someone who lives in the same place where he lives, right? To do that and try to pay out of pocket from that. It's unfortunate that he has to hide it, that he needs to do this in this way, right? I don't think that's the best way forward, but he still finds a way to continue participating in the sexual space.
Does anyone else have a question? Otherwise, I've got one last one. I realize I've been hogging the question period. Anyone else? Okay.
I'm done, thank you.
I'm really interested in, you've talked about the advocacy piece of this and this recognition of both the power struggles between the organizations and the families around this, and then, you know, the extent to which, depending on, you know, who's on staff one day, who your parent happens to be, and their own understanding, the quality and the access here looks really different. But then on the other hand, these spaces of that groups are creating themselves. How do you think about beginning to reconcile some of this and approaching both this very large social challenge around helping people who are working with those with intellectual disabilities get more comfortable around these issues, and then on the other side, helping people help themselves and be supports for others with intellectual disabilities around how to advocate around this?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I'll give a couple examples. Around the advocacy, I think there are some really amazing, incredible self-advocates here in Ontario even. So there's a group, for example, I don't remember the name now, it's something around rights. And what this group is a group of self-advocates, one social worker who has been working with the community for a long time, and a lawyer. And what do is go around the province, talking to connecting with other self-advocates, support workers, really focus on here are the rights that people have, right? We have to accept them. These are non-negotiable. And here are some of the ways that people have done that protects people's, safety and keeps people safe and allows them to navigate this, with some information and supports, and allows us to protect their rights. So I think this ground roots work is the most incredible one, right? So you have people with lived experiences guiding this work, and it makes a difference. Around the support workers, I think, my work has been, creating spaces in organizations that we can have those open conversations. So going to the organizations, talking to them, like, this is the evidence. I think we're very lucky as scholars, right, that we have access to all this data, data and studies. We can say, the best practices around this, according to the literature, is actually to educate people or to encourage this or not discourage that. And I think most people are open to this. And I've seen support workers who are already trying to intervene and change things. I've seen workers who are asking their executive directors, like, we need to have a policy on this, because we should not have different people making different decisions based on their own values, right, and ideas of sexuality. So I think that's what is important. Organizations need to come up with a very clear agreement. We're going to respect people's rights, and here's how we're going to address these cases, right?
Thank you so much, Alan. I am incredibly grateful for this conversation. I think it's going to be very valuable for many of us to think much more deeply about these issues and the nuance and the complexity of what you're looking at.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you so much for this opportunity. I really, really enjoyed, and I really appreciate the opportunity to, share these experiences that I listened to. And yeah, thank you for the space.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We'll have our next productivity during pandemic speaker is coming Wednesday. It's every Wednesday and Friday. So we'll send out information as those come up. Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you.